I think it's primarily an appreciation of certain poets and poems and an expression of gratitude for the pleasure and illumination that comes from reading poems attentively. It's also, of course, an appreciation of Michael Paul Gallagher. So like him, I'm a Jesuit priest. Like him, I am, if you like, a professional believer, feeling enriched by that belief, while still always needing to pray, help my unbelief. And like him, I think, my responses to the world are fundamentally shaped by literature, including poetry, sometimes almost inseparable from my experience of faith, and sometimes in quite sharp tension with it. So first, I'll leave aside any explicit religious referent. Poetry often enables us to glimpse new aspects of material reality or to see that reality in a new and fuller way. So poetry often, but I'll use this word often quite a lot. There are many kinds of poetry. I'm not speaking about all kinds of poetry, but often it enables us to glimpse new aspects of material reality or to see that reality in a new and fuller, deeper way. And of course, poetry isn't unique in this. In her wonderful memo called An American Childhood, Annie Dillard speaks of what she learned from her first attempts to draw. And she writes this: "Evidently, a given object took no particular time to draw. Instead, the artist took the time, or didn't take it, at pleasure. And similarly, things themselves possessed no fixed and intrinsic amount of interest. Instead, things were interesting as long as you had attention to give them." When I read that, I've reread that book a couple of times. I remember one of my junior school teachers used to tell us, "Don't say that's boring, say I'm bored. The lack of interest belongs to you, not what you say is boring." Still, if poetry isn't the only way of doing that, it often does enhance our interest in and our attention to reality and its depth. And so the narrator of a novel by the Canadian Robertson Davis called The Manticore writes, "I just begin to see that poetry was about life, and not ordinary life, but the essence and miraculous underside of life." Now, of course, that's Gerard Manley Hopkins's inscape. There is the dearest freshness, deep down things. For Hopkins, that perception has theological roots. The poem from which that line is taken is called God's Grandeur. And his own poetry often justifies that claim. But today I'm taking less familiar examples. And here is the opening of a poem by one of my favorite contemporary poets, the Australian Les Murray. And this poem is called First Essay on Interest.
Not usually, but interest. The cup slowed in mid-raise, the short whistle, hum, the little forwards shift mark our intake of that non-physical breath which the lungs mimic sharply to cancel the gap and pressure left by our self vanishing into its own alert. What we have received is the ordinary mail of the other world, wholly common, not postmarked divine. No one refuses delivery.
So this device, sometimes startling metaphors, the ordinary mail of the other world, and so on, often verbal and visual puns, as we'll see later in Murray. It's often associated with the so-called Martian poets, such as the best known, I think, is Craig Raine. The technique of defamiliarization, intending to kind of refresh our perceptions and often to amuse. So in Raine's poem, In Morning Dress, he represents a baby as stuck in the high chair like a pillory, features pelted with food. But I think Murray is more than, if you like, pleasantly surprising. His ordinary mail of the other world indicates that, in the language of our conference, he's diving deeper. And I think in two ways. The following poem, which I cite in part but quite substantially, is full of intelligence, as you'll see, with a couple of jokes thrown in.
Homage to the launching place. Pleasure craft of the sprung rhythms, bed, kindest of quadrupeds. You are also the unrocking boat that moves on silence. Straining hatchway into this word, you sustain our collapses above earth. Guarantor of evolution, you are our raised baseline. Resisting gravity for us and in us, you form a planet-wide, unobtrusive, discontinuous platform. A layer, the mattress sphere. Pretty nearly our highest common level. Tables may dispute it. Primly dressed, linen-collared one. You look so still for your speed. Shield that carries us to the fight and bears us from it.
I think some of those phrases could have been written by Craig Raine. Kindest of quadrupeds for the bed. Primly dressed, linen-collared one. But the joke, the matrosphere, is more than a joke. It precisely evokes that atmospheric layer of the imagination located just above or maybe below the stratosphere. And the notion that the bed is the place of rest, of renewal, but also of openness to the unconscious, without which our imagination and creativity go unnourished, is coherent with Murray's whole poetic creed. It's worth noting that Karl Rahner, for example, has, in a little essay on night prayer, he describes it as an expression of trusting God at the moment when we happily accept immersion in a sphere of consciousness that is beyond our control. To trust God at the moment when we are beginning to fall asleep is a great kind of prayer for Rahner. And the second way, I think, is in which Murray goes beyond these Martian poets. It doesn't only evoke a kind of a life within things, but it evokes gifts of the Spirit. And so this is the second extract from Murray I'll speak of, a poem called The Quality of Sprawl. Murray's Australian and a rural Australian. And sprawl is a virtue he takes to be characteristic of Australians at their best. It's a kind of instinctive and unostentatious generosity. It's thinking big without being either arrogant or callous. So I think the word magnanimity comes close, but the word sprawl suggests something which is indigenous, something which even includes a little bit of self-mockery. And so here is quite a large extract from this poem called The Quality of Sprawl.
The quality of sprawl. Sprawl is the quality of the man who cut down his Rolls Royce into a farm utility truck. And sprawl is what the company lacked when it made repeated efforts to buy the vehicle back and repair its image. Sprawl is doing your farming by aeroplane, roughly, or driving a hitchhiker that extra 100 miles home. It is never lighting cigars with $10 notes. That's idiot ostentation and murder of starving people. Sprawl is Hank Stamper in Never Give an Inch, bisecting an obstructive official's desk with a chainsaw, not harming the official. Sprawl is never brutal, though it's often intransigent. Sprawl is never Simon de Montfort as a town storming, "Kill them all, God will know his own." Knowing the man's name this was said to, might be Sprawl. Sprawl gets up the nose of many kinds of people, every kind that comes in kinds, whose futures don't include it. Some decry it as criminal presumption, silken-robed Pope Alexander dividing the new world between Spain and Portugal. If he smiled in petto afterwards, perhaps the thing did have sprawl. Sprawl leans on things. It is loose-limbed in its mind. Reprimanded and dismissed, it listens with a grin and one boot up on the rail of possibility. It may have to leave the earth. Being roughly Christian, it scratches the other cheek and thinks it unlikely. Though people have been shot for sprawl.
So Murray's evoking a kind of virtue which he thinks of as rural. Some of those references are surely outside the range of people whom he admires. So Simon de Montfort, Pope Alexander VI, and so on. But those references are juxtaposed with a kind of a demotic language, which those people might well use, gets up the nose of. Murray often teases the human tendency to reduce a complex personal reality to convenient kind of ideological abstractions. So here, it gets up the nose of many kinds of people, every kind that thinks in kinds. And then in the line, being roughly Christian, it scratches the other cheek. I think the wit of scratches the other cheek gives full value both to this adjective rough with the adverb roughly and the adjective Christian. And similarly, both a kind of skeptical barroom realism and yet this imagination which can hope are both evoked in that phrase, one boot on the rail of possibility. And finally, what's apparently a throwaway conclusion, though people have been shot for sprawl, seems to me to have weight. A real generosity of spirit in a narrow and self-righteous culture is dangerous. So in the second section, I want to speak a bit about poetry under the heading of form, of kind of linguistic register, and of language itself. So I think delight and recognition can be conveyed by any of these ways. So if we take a poem such as Robert Graves's A Reminder, the poem very ingeniously makes its content the form itself.
Capital letters prompting every line. Lines printed down the centre of each page. Clear spaces between groups of these combine in a convention of respectable age to mean read carefully. Each word we chose has rhythm and sound and sense. This is not prose.
And so I think appropriately that the language there is very plain, unvarnished, concise. Graves insists every word counts. And the power of form, I think, and concision survives even the loss which is inevitable in translation. So here's a little, rather salutary little verse of Bertolt Brecht, translated by Leslie Landrum, which may console those engage in any kind of planning that affects other people and their interests.
When it's a notion, when it's still vague, it is praised. When it looms large, when plans are in motion, objections are raised.
I have almost no German, so I can't speak for the resonance of that as against the German, but the power of the form survives. But now see what a poet called U.A. Fanthorpe, Ursula Fanthorpe, but she always used her initials, does with form. She lived from 1929 to 2009. She'd taken a first in Oxford. She was a teacher for 16 years at Cheltenham Ladies' College, which, no doubt unfairly, is kind of emblematic of order to the point of fussiness. But then when she was 45, she took a job as a receptionist in a Bristol hospital. And it was then that she began to write poetry. In her own words, she was fiercely devoted to the outpatients, who were my business, she says. She often found herself, again I quote, against the doctors who always had the last word, usually a medical cliché. And so she found her subject, the strangeness of other people. And yet she never treats that strangeness in a kind of cool or demeaning way. And so in the next poem called The List, we find the hospital typist as a kind of artist. So if you like, the humble typist too is honored here. And she honors a humanity that strains at the bounds of order, whose dignity may be intrinsic, for sure, but is rarely acknowledged. And in the poem, Fanthorpe enacts that dignity, and precisely, I think, through poetic form.
The List. Flawlessly typed and spaced at the proper intervals, serene and lordly, they pace along tomorrow's list like gift-bearers on a frieze. In tranquil order, arrayed with the basic human equipment, a name, a time, a number, they advance on the future. Not more homonies who pace holding a hawk, a fish, a jar, and customary offerings along the valley of the kings. Tomorrow these names will turn nasty, senile, pregnant, late, handicapped, handcuffed, unhandy, muddled, moribund, mute, be stained by living. But here, orderly, equal, right, on the edge of tomorrow, they pause like gift-bearers on a frieze with the proper offering. A time, a number, a name. I am the artist, the typist. I did my best for them.
So that very concise and precise poem doesn't negate feeling any more than Mozart's formal restraint negates the intensity of his music. Mozart is not less intense than Beethoven or Rachmaninoff. And in any case, their apparently freer forms are no less conscious. So to turn to what I call register, we saw Les Murray kind of characteristically shifting register from the learned to the homely, and I think with great effect. The contemporary English master of these kind of effects may be Philip Larkin. So the famous beginning of his poem, This Be the Verse, was evidently written to shock and amuse, and still does both, I think. It's only 3 verses, and it says something about me. I think that it's one of the poems I know off by heart. They fuck you up for your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. And then I skip the second, well, no, it's so short. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. And then the third stanza. man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. So just looking at the last stanza for a moment, that first couplet, man hands on misery to man, it deepens like a coastal shelf. It's a kind of, it turns the initial joke into a solemn, kind of sonorous, grim generalization about the futility of human life. But then, from there, you go back to a sarcastic second joke. Larkin is fairly well aware, I think, that this is not going to persuade his readers from procreation. And then in a second poem of Larkin, much less known, I think, called Vers de Société, the poem's narrator first paraphrases a social invitation from a fellow academic and then ponders his own reply.
My wife and I have asked a crowd of crats to come and waste their time and ours. But you care to join us? You pig's arse, friend. Day comes to an end. The gas fire breathes. The trees are darkly swayed. So, dear Warlock Williams, I'm afraid. Funny how hard it is to be alone. I could spend half my evenings if I wanted, holding a glass of washing sherry, canted over to catch the drivel of some bitch who's read nothing but witch.
That's a much longer poem of 7 or 8 stanzas. Very carefully composed. But just in that extract, the formal courtesy, perhaps you care to join us, mocks the host's imagined crude disdain for his guests, a crowd of craps wasting their time and ours. But since that tone is matched by the recipient's response, in a pig's arse friend, we realize that the contempt belongs not to the one who's invited, but to the poem's narrator, who then immediately shows how kind of aesthetically sensitive he is to the darkly swaying trees and a gas fire. And then the second stanza introduces the poem's underlying theme, almost the desperation to escape aloneness, which in the poem's last words will lead him to accept the invitation after all. Dear Warlock Williams, why, of course. It does this, though, while intensifying the loathing that will later turn in the poem to self-doubt. It's witty, washing sherry. I've heard of cooking sherry, but washing sherry. And the coarsely offensive, the drivel of some bitch. And the whole poem is constructed from that clash of registers. There's kind of evocation, there's crude insult, there's Larkin's trademark, at least alleged, misanthropy, including a more specific misogyny. Does the poem share that grossness? Yes, it does in a way, but it's also castigating the academic snobbery and stupidity of despising someone who is less well-read than himself. The fictive narrator is not the poet himself. That's the kind of crudest mistake of literary criticism. So where is Larkin himself, who's attracted such a mixture of admiration and opprobrium? And I think the poem is so enigmatic and so artful that we don't quite know. But the bleakness is unmistakable, and it's not at all mitigated by the comedy. So language itself, speak a little bit about that. Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, has a book called The Edge of Words. And he notes that how even ordinary speech can be unwittingly paradoxical and playful, because language itself is strange. And so the nice example given by Rowan Williams is the sentence, "I can't tell you how grateful I am," is precisely to tell you how grateful I am. My own first childhood sense of the strangeness of language came through common phrases like free house, meaning a pub, but I certainly went through a few weeks where I assumed the beer was without cost. And especially the baffling road sign, heavy plant crossing. Jokes, for example, revel in this strangeness of language. Here are just two one-liners. These were judged to be the two best jokes at the 2013 Edinburgh Festival. The universe implodes. No matter. And the winner? My wife and I have got rid of the Hoover. Well, it was just collecting dust. But the point is, Rowan Williams describes poetry too as excessive speech. It's a form of utterance that, in Williams's words, transcends what is functionally required. And yet another poem by Robert Graves shows this excess functioning with exactly the opposite effect. Language can also channel and temper the most intense reality of beauty or of terror, so as to render it capable of assimilation without psychic overload. Loss of control is dangerous. We don't want the pilots to have an ecstatic experience of the sunset. And so the kind of famous dictum of Lao Tse, the one who knows does not speak, the one who speaks does not know, is often very persuasive, and we distrust too much glibness in people. But so is the testimony of Peter and John when they're told by the religious authorities in Jerusalem to keep silence. We cannot not speak about what we have seen and heard. And that paradox of language is evoked by Robert Graves in another poem.
The cool web. Children are dumb to say how hot the day is, how hot the scent is of the summer rose, how dreadful the black wastes of evening sky, how dreadful the tall soldiers drumming by. But we have speech to chill the angry day, and speech to dull the rose's cruel scent. We spell away the overhanging night. We spell away the soldiers and her fright. There's a cool web of language winds us in. Retreat from too much joy or too much fear. We grow sea green at last and coldly die in brininess and volubility. But if we let our tongues lose self-possession, throwing off language in its watery clasp before our death, instead of when death comes, facing the wide glare of the children's day, facing the rose, the dark sky, and the drums, we shall go mad, no doubt, and die that way.
So language both articulates but also dulls the kind of intense personal experience that Graves is suggesting can validate our lives, but also can overwhelm our faculties. But, returning to the first poem of Graves, this is not prose. So the poem does more than that. It embodies a sense of our relationship with the ineffable that must still be spoken. And finally, in this section on language, here's a poem by an American, Liesl Miller, born 1924, but still living, I think. At least I couldn't find any record of her death. We've seen how language can help us see more and dive deeper, but in this poem, she reverses this dynamic perception. It's not just that poetic language can disclose things to us. Rather, objects on the one hand and linguistic experience on the other hand shape each other reciprocally. And so the poem's title is Things, but the subject is actually our relationship with things.
Things. We grew lonely, living among the things. So we gave the clock a face, a chair, a back, the table forced out legs, which will never suffer fatigue. We fitted our shoes with tongues as smooth as our own, and hung tongues inside bells, so we could listen to their emotional language. And because we loved graceful profiles, the picture received a lip, the bottle a long, slender neck. Even what was beyond us was recast in our own image. We gave the country a heart, a storm an eye, a cave a mouth, so we could pass into safety.
And now in the closing section, which is briefer than the other sections, I want to link poetry kind of explicitly to a religious transcendence. I don't like to separate those two streams of, in each case, of formation and potential transformation, the poetic on the one hand, the religious on the other. Admittedly, their confluence can cause sometimes whitewater turbulence, because poetry can expose with unequal power certain forms or perversions of religion. So remember Blake's The Garden of Love, in which the chapel has "Thou shalt not" writ over the door, and where priests in black gowns were walking their rounds and binding with briars my joys and desires. However, whether in our cultural environment or even in our own interiority, identifying a pathology of religion, as that does, is itself part of religious conversion. So the mutuality remains. And so coming back for a moment to Les Murray, he writes in a prose essay of 1989, "Humans are not rational, but poetic. For this reason, the world we've inherited is a vast texture of overlaid and overlapping poetries, often competing inside individual human heads." I notice now at this point, what I'm going to say in the next 5 minutes overlaps quite a lot with points that Tom was making, building on Michael Paul. A poetry, in Murray's sense, is not a single literary artifact, a poem, but a mental structure. We can't avoid ordering our perceptions into some poetic structure. Faith would be one, secularism would be another. And factual analysis often fails to dispel the vision that people live by. And Murray argues in a brilliant essay entitled in his rather self-mocking way, "Some Religious Stuff I Know About Australia," that the religious dimension too exists in every human being. And so Murray would argue that both poetry and religion structure our understanding and our perceptions, but less by rationalization than by inspiration. Now, Murray is not uncritical about inspiration. He writes in that essay, "God's Spirit may stir our soul and then not be allowed to enlighten it." And in that prose essay, he has a powerful critique of unenlightened inspiration. But that critique, even in prose, conveys the sensibility of a poet, because he works less through conceptual analysis than by diving deeper into a metaphor. And so let me read a paragraph from that essay, "Some Religious Stuff I Know About Australia," when he's talking about the notion of human sacrifice and its religious corrective. So he writes this: "Surely human sacrifice is an archaic horror that survives only very marginally in a few groups that anthropologists write about. Surely the Holocausts of this century can only be called human sacrifices in a very metaphorical kind of way. Surely there's a distinction to be made here between the literal and the metaphorical. My answer is there may be, but I don't know of one watertight enough to prevent the blood from seeping through it. When I hear someone say, as I did again the other day, that this country, so Australia, this country, needs a war to restore and cement its sense of community, I recognize that as a call to literal human sacrifice to be performed for one of the classic archaic reasons. And this despite not only the Enlightenment we used to praise as our deliverance from such archaic nonsense, but also despite the much earlier action of Christ in consciously taking the ancient human motif of sacrifice on himself and, as it were, completing and sealing it, so that henceforth we might refer the whole complex impulse to his action and never enact it literally on a living victim. Now, if humans are not rational but poetic, then we would expect, and rightly I think, the religious transcendent to be better expressed imaginatively and poetically than by attempted conceptual definition. So in Scripture, for example, the hymn of Philippians 2 discloses the self-emptying and the glorification of Christ before that is done conceptually in doctrine, and I think more nourishingly than it's ever done in doctrine. The Gospels too, of course, exult in profound wordplay. The Christ who is lifted up, meaning at the same time in agony and in glory. The Christ who is handed over, meaning both to his executioners and to the divine will. In poetry, Shakespeare's wit and puns often intensify the sense of tragedy rather than dilute it. So in Act 1, Scene 2 of Hamlet, there's this brief exchange. Hamlet, what is your affair in Elsinore? Horatio, my lord, I came to see your father's funeral. Hamlet, I pray thee don't mock me, fellow student. I think it was to see my mother's wedding. And in the same scene, Hamlet's uncle, Claudius, the new king of Denmark, is said to be, by Hamlet, a little more than kin and less than kind. Or recall the famous punning conclusion of John Donne's Batter My Heart. For I, except you enthrall me, never shall be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. That passage makes sense and acquires its whole power only because the words enthrall and ravish each have both a meaning which is ecstatically positive and a meaning which is destructively negative. And so that paradox, that poetry, if you like, is inherent in the Christian belief that true freedom is paradoxically found in obedience to the divine will, and that chastity is a function of loving union. And now I end with part of a poem by the contemporary American, well, almost contemporary, Denis Levertov, lived 1923 to 1997. And it's fascinating because it reverses the pattern which I've been exploring. She doesn't contemplate something ordinary and then discern in it some deeper and perhaps transcendent reality. She does just the opposite. She takes a religious image, in this case the Lamb of God, an image that's evolved through a complex, even esoteric theological history. It's so esoteric that in the edition in which this poem appears that I have, it defies the proofreaders, because the poem is called Agnus Dei, but in the contents list of my book it's called Angus Dei. But Levertov then, what she does is she redirects us from the theological resonance of this image to the ordinary reality, though this ordinary reality is observed with extraordinary attention and even tenderness.
Agnus Dei. Given that lambs are infant sheep, that sheep are afraid and foolish, and lack the means of self-protection, having neither rage nor claws, venom nor cunning, what then is this Lamb of God? This pretty creature, vigorous to nuzzle at milky dugs, wool-bearer, bleater, leaper in air for delight of being, with whom we would like to play, but may not bring into our houses because it would soil the floor with its droppings. What terror lies concealed in strangest words. O Lamb of God that taketh away the sins of the world. And innocence, smelling of ignorance, born in bloody snowdrifts, licked by forbearing dogs more intelligent than its entire flock put together. God then, encompassing all things, is defenseless. Omnipotence has been tossed away, reduced to a wisp of damp wool. And we, frightened, bored, wanting only to sleep till catastrophe has raged, clashed, seethed, and gone by without us wanting then to awake in quietude without remembrance of agony. Is it implied that we must protect this perversely weak animal, whose muzzle's nudgings suppose there is milk to be found in us, must hold to our icy hearts a shivering God? So be it.
Thank you.